Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel. Just so recently, I got introduced to a great backend framework for Node.js applications known as NestJS, and I have been loving it so far. So what I'm going to do in this video is basically share my knowledge and teach you how to build a NestJS backend application. So NestJS, just so I can kind of introduce it to you, it has full TypeScript support, and it's really 99% of the time it's going to be built with TypeScript, which is great. And it's really object-oriented heavy. Another thing is that Nest is built on top of Express. So if you have experience with Express, which is by far the most popular Node.js framework, then Nest should be a little bit easier for you. Yes, there's going to be some nuances, there's going to be some differences, but Nest should be relatively easy. At the end of the day, we're just building an API. And it's also optionally configured with Fastify if you wanted to, but I think most people are more familiar with Express. Now, Express, what it does is it's really great, but it really gives you kind of the bare bone. And essentially what Nest does is it really provides a level of abstraction above these frameworks, and it gives you a really great way of organizing and separating your concerns. So this is what we're going to be doing. I'm going to try to cover as much as I can. I'm going to probably cover everything here in the documentation, but I'm inevitably going to miss something. So feel free to go to the nestjs.com documentation and give it a read. It's really thorough and really great. Now, in this application, we're going to be building an API, and we're going to be building a very, very simple API. So over here, we basically are building an API that allows us to get teachers and their associated students. So here are the 8 different routes that we are going to be building. So over here we have a get route, which is just /students, and this is just going to get all of the students regardless of their teachers. This is a get route that is going to get a specific student based on that student ID. And this is a post route that is going to create a student, and we're going to basically pass the data in the rec.body. And then over here, this is a put, and the put I'm actually missing here. This should also have student ID. And essentially what this is going to be doing is it's going to update a specific student by that student ID, and we're also going to add the data that we want to update that student with in the request body. And then over here, we're going to start having the teacher route. So over here, we have /teachers that just gets all the teachers. This gets all the teachers with a specific ID. This gets all of the students that are associated to a particular teacher. And lastly, what this is going to do is going to update the student update the student's teacher to whatever this teacher ID is over here. So if that doesn't make a lot of sense, don't worry too much about it, but this is really just a simple REST API that we are going to be building with NestJS. Now, if you ever feel stuck, or if your code isn't working for some reason, feel free to go to my GitHub page. In my GitHub page, I try to do the best job to organize basically what I am going to be doing. So if you want, you don't have to start in the main directory or the main repository. You can basically go into different branches if you want to. And that basically, what that basically does is it kind of eliminates, let's go over here, like it kind of eliminates all of the extra work if you're not there yet. So for instance, if you go, we're starting off with controllers, you can see that we have this little code over here, so you can try to follow along as much as possible through navigating the branches. So I'm super excited. This is a great Node.js framework. I'm actually using it at work and I'm loving it thus far. So I hope my explanations are good, and hopefully you enjoy this framework. Okay, so the first thing that we are going to cover is creating a boilerplate NestJS project. And thankfully, this is really, really easy. We just have to do a few commands inside of our terminal. Now, how do you know what these commands are? Well, you can go to the documentation, and it says here that we are going to be using the built-in Nest CLI in order to create our Nest application. So the first thing is you need to install the Nest CLI. So let me just zoom in here a little bit. The command to install the Nest CLI inside of your local machine is npm I, or install, and then -g for the global flag, and then at nestjs/CLI. So go ahead and run this inside of your terminal. I already did, and this actually takes a little bit of time, so I'm not going to go ahead and do it again. But you run this right now in your terminal, and of course you need Node.js to run this because we are using npm. And then what you can do is you can just do nest-v to check the version of Nest that you have installed. And this basically ensures that, hey, yes, you have Nest installed. So if you have any sort of number over here, whether it's higher, lower, exactly the same, that means you have Nest installed, the Nest CLI installed in your machine. If you get some sort of command saying, hey, Nest not found, command not found, then no, you probably didn't install it correctly. So go ahead and install this. Now, mind you, if you are on a Mac or Linux, you might have to prefix this with sudo and then input your credentials, your password. All right, and then the next thing that you have to do is run this command over here. So we're using the Nest CLI, so nest, and then we're saying new, basically symbolizing we want to create a new project, and then we're just gonna give our project a name. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So we're gonna do nest new, and then we're gonna give our project Nest app. So we're gonna call it Nest app. I hope this is large enough. There we go. So once you execute this command, then you're going to basically be prompted with a question. Hey, do you want to use npm or do you want to use yarn? I'm going to stick with npm because that's probably what most people do. I actually do prefer yarn over npm, but I'm just going to stick to npm just in case people don't have yarn installed on their local machine. But honestly, you can pick either or. So you can go ahead and do that. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to cancel it because I already installed this app boilerplate. So I'm not going to go ahead and do it again because, again, it would take too long. So if I do ls, what it will do is basically create an app for me inside of my local directory. So this is the app that we just created, and I actually didn't fully install it, so it's not fully complete. But then this is the app that I actually installed beforehand. So this is the one that I'm going to be using. And so if I go cd my Nest app, well, now I'm inside of that directory. So I can go ahead and open that. And if you have VS Code, you can actually open up with code dot. And what this is going to do is going to open up in your VS Code text editor. If you set this up, of course. If not, then just go ahead, open up VS Code or whatever text editor you're choosing, navigate to your Nest directory and open it up. Now I already opened it up. And I'm getting an app that looks a little something like this. So you can see here that you have a lot of boilerplate, and we're mainly going to be discussing everything inside of the source directory. So over here you can see here that, okay, inside the source directory you still have a lot of things. We have the app controller.spec.ts. This is just a bunch of test files. We have the controller. Okay, what's going on here? We got the module, we also have the service, and then we also have the main.ts. And we're going to talk about all of these files and more, so don't worry all too much about it. But for now, what I want to do is just clean up this source directory a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the main.ts and the app.module.ts. I'm not going to touch them, but everything else I am going to delete. So let's go ahead and let's just delete them for now. So I'm just going to delete this. This is the test file. We're going to delete the app.controller. So let's go ahead and not rename it. Let's delete it, completely wipe it out of existence. And then let's also get rid of the service as well. So the app.service.ts. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to create a directory called app. And I'm just going to place the app module inside of that directory. Okay, so now what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to do some fixes, okay? Because over here you can see that the app .module is actually using the app controller and the app service, which we just deleted. So let's get rid of that. And what's great about TypeScript is it tells us everything that is going wrong. Let's also get rid of the controllers and the providers as well. Let's save that. And then inside of our main.ts file, what we're going to have to do is fix this over here, because remember, we put our app.modules.ts inside of the app directory. So now what we can do is something like this. So move into the app directory and then move into the app modules. So I'm going to talk about the modules in great detail, but I'm going to just quickly illustrate this right now, just what's going on right over here. So in here we have this app module, and you can really think of this as the root of our application. Again, you don't have to worry about what it's doing. Just know that the app.module.ts is the root of our application, and it should have basically all of the logic of our applications imported into this app.module.ts. Now inside of the main.ts, essentially all that we're doing is bootstrapping or starting up our project. So you can see here we have const app, and we're basically creating our Nest application using the Nest factory. And so this is asynchronous. So you can see here, using the Nest factory, we're creating a Nest application, and we're passing into it the root of our application. Again, don't have to worry about what it does now. I'll explain that in great detail. But we're basically passing in our application, the root of our application, which is the node modules. So what that's doing is going to create a Nest application with this right over here, with this root. And then what it's doing is it's basically running that on port 3000. And so essentially we're basically running our application, our Nest application, on port 3000. And this is just a function, and we're just calling it right over here. So that is what we are doing, and that is just basically what we're going to be talking about. Now, that is the boilerplate. In the next section, we're actually going to start working on our APIs. We're actually going to start creating each and every route, and we're actually going to be able to test each and every route on Postman. So we'll get to that in the next section. Let's start creating the API routes that we have discussed right over here. Now in Nest, we do that through something known as a controller. And let me quickly explain what a controller is. So simply put, a controller is something that accepts HTTP requests and sends back a response to the client. And that's all it's doing. All of the business logic associated to manufacturing that response is not housed inside of the controller. It's housed somewhere else. So the controller is ultimately going to make a call and basically call that function, but it's not housed inside of the controller itself. All the controller is responsible for is accepting HTTP requests and sending back a response. And in our application, we can have multiple controllers. So let's actually kind of go through a flow. So over here we have our client, and let's say our client wants to get all of the students. So it's going to make a get request to /students. So what this is going to do is going to be forwarded to a specific controller that's going to handle that request. So let's say that that controller is this blue one right over here. So it's basically going to get this request, and then it's going to return a response with all of the student data. That's all the controller is doing. Again, let's see here, we have another request. Let's say that we want to get all of the teachers. Then what we're going to do here is we're going to make a request to another controller that's handling basically all of the teachers. And this controller is then going to send back a response with all of that teacher data. Now, a controller is not only basically subjected to just one route. So over here, we have basically another route that we want to make, and this is getting one student. And essentially what this is going to do is going to go to this controller over here. And again, the logic that is housed to get this is not going to be inside the controller, but this controller is going to call the function that's going to have all the logic to get that student. But then once it gets that data, it's going to send it back to the client. But as you can see here, that this controller is actually handling multiple routes. And it doesn't also even have to handle just GET requests. One controller can handle 10 or 20 or even 1,000,000 routes as much as we specify, and they can handle GET requests, and we can handle POST requests, and we can handle delete requests. But typically a controller is going to house routes and are going to deal with routes that are common. For instance, here we're basically dealing with students. So you can see here, this is slash students, that's getting all the students, and that's why it's dealt with in this controller. And this is slash student ID, that's getting one student. And so it's basically housed by this one controller that's dealing with all of the students. Over here, this is dealing with teachers, so it's going to be in a different controller. Okay, so I hope that makes sense, but the best way to learn is through practice. So let's actually go ahead and let's create this controller. So to create a controller, what we're going to do is, let's start off with the student controller, because we're going to create a bunch of student routes. So we have, you know, the slash students, slash student ID, slash students for a post request, and slash student dot ID or colon ID. And this is basically an update. Now over here, this is right here is going to be housed in one controller because we are really just dealing with student routes here. So it makes sense to create some sort of student controller. So to do that, what we are going to do is we are going to create a new directory, not inside of the app.js, but inside of the source directory, and we're going to call it student. And this is going to basically house our student controller and all the other student related things that we'll eventually add in there. So in here, what we are going to do is we're going to create a student.controller.ts. So student.controller.ts. Now in here, we have to specify that we are going to create a controller. So how do we do that? Well, we do that in Nest through something known as decorators. So decorators are very important because they basically identify what the thing that we are trying to create is. And it actually gives it a lot of metadata that is required for its functionality. Now, how do we get the decorators? Well, the majority of the decorators are going to be inside of the at NestJS/common module. And this is all automatically installed for us when we have created our Nest project with the Nest CLI. So in here, we're going to take the controller decorator. So the controller decorator right here. So we're going to basically import that in. Now, a controller is basically a class that is going to contain a bunch of methods. And these methods are going to be called for specific routes. So we're going to create this class, and we're going to call this class student controller. So we're going to call this class student controller. And we are going to decorate it with the @controller decorator, basically signifying that, hey, this is a controller. This is going to tell Nest that this is a controller class. So to do that, we would do @controller at the very top, and we would basically call it right over here. So now we have our controller. So this is our student controller. Now in here, we are basically going to define all these routes right here. So we have the get students, we have the get student ID, post, and the put. Now, one thing in common with all of these routes is that they all start with students. They all start with students. So what we can actually do inside of this controller decorator is say that, hey, these all start with student. So now basically what's going to happen is every single method inside of our controller is going to start off with /students. So /students, which is terrific because again, everything in here starts with student anyways. Okay, so now let's actually start creating our actual routes. So how do we do this? Well, it's actually not that complicated. So let's begin with the very first one, which is the easiest one. So again, what we're doing is for each route, we're creating a method that we're ultimately going to call. So let's actually start off with this first one right over here. So this is going to be the get students route. So this is the get students route. So once we hit basically just /students, and what we were going to want to do is basically get all of our students. And we're going to return some data. So we're going to return some data. And for now, I'm just going to say all students. Obviously, we're going to want to return an array of all of our students, but for now, I'm just going to return the string. So that is the method that we are going to call with this request over here. But how in the world is it going to know that, hey, this is a get request? Because we know that, okay, this control is going to handle /students, but how do we know that this is a get request or a post request or a delete request? Well, we can basically specify this through a get decorator. So we have the get decorator. So right over here, we can basically say get. So right on top of this method, we have the get decorator, and Nest is smart enough to know that, okay, well, if we have a get request that is /students, then forward it right over here to this method, and basically return this data, return whatever data that it ultimately returns. So let's actually give this a shot. All right, so now, of course, this is actually not going to work right away. And the reason for this is our application actually has no idea that this controller even exists. So remember, our app.module.ts, that's basically the root of our application, and it has no idea that this file even exists. So what we somehow have to do is tell our app.modules.ts file that, hey, I want you to actually use this controller. Now, to do this, what we are going to do is we're going to specify inside of this object right over here. And this, if this doesn't make sense to you, don't worry, we'll cover modules in great detail. But for now, inside of this object, there is going to be a controller's key that we can specify. And this is going to take in an array of all the controllers that we want. So what we can basically do is export this controller and basically import it into this file and then put it into this array. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and let's just export this out. Let's save that. And let's go ahead in here. We're going to import our student controller from in the students directory, the student controller, and we want the student controller. So now we can basically go in here and we can go ahead and save that. Okay, terrific. Now we actually have to go ahead and run our application. So let's go ahead and run it right now. So I am opening up my integrated VS Code terminal. And to run our application, let's take a look at the package.json. So in the package.json, we have a bunch of script. You have pre-build, build, format. Now, if you want to actually start your application, highly suggest start:dev. And this is basically going to run our application, but it's going to run our application in watch mode. And basically what that's going to do is if we make any change, we don't have to restart our application. It's automatically going to catch those changes and configure our running application accordingly. So let's actually do that right now. So let's do npm run start:dev. And this should run our application on localhost 3000. So let's just wait a little bit. It shouldn't take too long. And now once this is up and running, and it is up and running, I want to test this route. And so the best way to test routes, in my opinion, is through Postman. So I absolutely love Postman. Let me get rid of this right over here because I'm going to be going back and forth with Postman a lot. Postman is basically a way to test out our API routes. So let's actually figure out what we want to test. So again, what we're going to be testing is the API, which is going to be running in localhost 3000 and then /students, because that's what our controller is specifying. So if I were to execute this, you can see here that I actually get back all students, which is terrific because that's exactly what we want. Let me quickly zoom in just in case you guys don't see it. But right there, that is exactly what we want, which is great. All right, so now let's actually move on to the next route, which is unfortunately right over here. There we go. I actually So the next route is going to be /students. And then over here, we're gonna have basically a dynamic parameter, the student ID. Okay, so how do we tackle that? That one's a little bit trickier. Okay. So let's talk about how we do that. So in the student controller, what we are going to do is we're going to specify a method. This is the method that's going to be called when basically our client is making this HTTP request. So this is going to be get student, just one student by ID. So this is the method that we're going to call. And for now, we're just going to return, get student by ID. And let me capitalize student for consistency. And we know that this is going to be a get request. So for sure, we're going to have the @get decorator. But at this point, these two routes are exactly the same and they're actually clashing. What we actually want is /students and then /students and then / whatever that student ID is. Now to specify additional paths to the core one that we have over here, we would add that inside of the actual decorator, the request decorator right over here. And so this is basically where we would add it. And so essentially now what we are going to be doing is adding that in there. So let's go ahead and let's do that. And so basically now what we're going to be doing is /:, and this is just basic express /students or /student ID. So /student ID. And so essentially here, all we're basically doing is we're saying that, hey, this is going to be /student and then a student ID. And again, this is a dynamic route because we specified the colon right over here. So if I were to save this now and I were to make this request, so /student this is an actual student ID. And if I were to send this off, it fails for some reason, which is strange. I wonder why that is. /student ID, invalid regular expression. Let me quickly save this again. I'm actually a little surprised that that failed. Oh, the reason why it's failed is because I just left this over here. Okay, that's why it failed. All right, so let's actually go ahead and let's send this request off again. You can see here, get student by ID. Okay, terrific. So now let us quickly breeze through the other ones because we still have 6 more to go, which is pretty insane. So now let's do the post request and the put request. And this should be very, very similar. So for the post request, again, we're going to create a method. And this is going to be called create student, because that's what we're doing. We're creating a student. And now we're just going to return for this. We're going to return just create. We're going to return create student. Now over here, this is not going to be a get request. This is going to be a post request. So now what we can basically do is just do /post. And then we can do @post the decorator right over here. So now again, if we go here, you can make this request. And of course it fails for some reason because I didn't save it. So let me save it. And now if I were to make this request again, you can see here, create student. All right, so for the last one, for the student controller is the put. So let's actually get this decorator is the put. And by the way, there's more methods, of course. There's patch if you want to use that. There's delete. I believe there's also all. So there's more if you want to use them. I'm just going to cover these 3. So I'm going to say @put. And then I'm going to do update student. And then I'm over here, I'm just going to simply return update student by ID. Update student by ID. And again, this is a little bit more complicated because again, we have to specify a random URL right over here, a random param. So to do that, simply we would just add it inside of this request object. So we're going to add that in there. Okay, so terrific. So that's pretty much it. And you can see here that controllers, all they're doing is they're getting requests and they're sending back responses. So that's pretty much it for this. Now let's actually quickly work on these ones. And I actually highly suggest that you pause the video and try it out on your own, because this is going to be extremely similar. Now there's going to be a little bit of a change in the last two, but again, I highly suggest that you go ahead and try this on your own. I'll give you 5 seconds to pause the video. If not, then you can continue following along and see if you got the answer right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, cool. So let's actually go ahead and create this controller. Now, one thing that I want to note is that creating controllers can be relatively repetitive. We're going to have to import the controller, and then we have to create the controller, and then we're going to have to create this class controller. It can get pretty repetitive. And you know what? The CLI is actually really great, and it knows that it can get repetitive. And then, so basically what we can use is the CLI to create our controllers for us. So to create a controller, we can actually go to the documentation. So we can go to the Express documentation, or the Nest documentation rather. And in here, if I zoom out a little bit, you can see here that we can actually create a controller through this command, nest generate, and then we want to generate a controller, and then we're going to give our controller a name. So let's actually go about doing that right now. So let's do nest. So let's do nest G for generate, and we want to generate a controller, and we're going to generate a controller with the name of teacher. And I'm also going to specify the no spec flag, and this basically ensures that it doesn't create any test files for us. So it just creates the controller. So let's go ahead and let's execute this. Let's give it some time. Okay, so we can see here that it has created a controller. And not only has it created the controller, it actually created the directory. It created a teacher directory. And in here, you can see that we have a teacher.controller. So you can see here that we have all of the boilerplate for us already made, which is really great. Now, one thing that I want to change is I want the path to be /teachers, not teacher. So I'm going to just change that to teacher. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to create the rest of the routes. So basically all of these routes. So let's go ahead and let's do that quickly together. So the first route is going to be, and let me just quickly open up the code in my other machine so I can follow along. Okay. So the first route is going to be at get, and so you notice that I actually auto imported it, which is pretty cool. So at get, and this is going to be get teachers. So we're going to get all the teachers, and we're going to return all teachers. So we're going to return all teachers. The next request is going to be at get, and then this is going to get a specific teacher by ID. So we're going to get a specific teacher by its ID. All right, so over here, of course, we have to specify the teacher ID. All right, so what are the next paths? Well, now we're actually start dealing with some of the paths that involve the students. So let's go ahead and let's create them. So remember, we have the get all students that are associated to a particular teacher. And so let's actually just copy this. And what we're going to do now is we're going to do, this is going to be /teachers/teacher ID and then /students. And so we're going to call this, we're actually going to call this get students. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to call this get students. And then lastly, we're going to have the at put, and then this is going to be update a student teacher. And so to basically call this function, we're going to need all of this right over here. So we're going to need the teacher ID, and then we're going to call the students param, and then /student ID. Okay, so that is what we are doing right over here. Now, one thing that I want to note is that these two routes are getting quite similar. You can see that they both start off with :teacher ID / students, :teacher ID / students. Now it's perfectly acceptable for us to leave it over here if we want to, but let's say our file continuously grows and grows and grows and grows, and we have actually a lot of routes that are just /teacher and then /:ID or /whatever, and then we also have a lot of routes that follow kind of this trajectory: /teacher ID /student, /teacher ID /student. It actually might be good to separate that into a separate controller, especially that these two routes are actually dealing with students really. So it might be a better idea that in this teacher directory to actually create another controller that deals with all of these student routes that are associated somehow in some way with teachers. So let's actually create another route right over here, or another controller, and then we're going to call this controller student.controller.ts. Now we could have definitely generated this controller inside of the Nest CLI, but it's all right. We don't have to do that. So now what we have to do is we can basically just copy and paste this. Let's just copy and paste the whole thing. And what we're going to do is we're going to call this student teacher controller. And we're going to get rid of this over here. And we're just going to leave these two. And we're going to get rid of these two right over here. And you can see that that really cleans up our file actually, which is pretty cool. So now what we can actually do is basically say that, hey, this is always going to start off with /teachers / :teacher ID / student. So now we can actually completely get rid of this because that follows that path. And basically here we can just say that, hey, this is just going to append / student ID. And now one thing that I am forgetting is of course the returns. So let's actually add those in real quick. So we're gonna over here just return some data. So we're gonna return get all students that belong to a teacher. So this is getting all the students that belong to a teacher. Unless over here we're going to quickly return update student teacher, because we're updating the student's teacher for this. And then lastly, for our student controller, I'm missing over here get. So over here we're get teacher by its ID. Okay, terrific. Now again, our application actually has no idea about these routes, even though we saved them. So now if we go ahead and we try to execute this, it's still going to fail. It's going to say, hey, well, there's no route found. So to fix this, of course, we have to tell our app.module.ts about our controller. So we're going to have to import them in. So let's go ahead and let's just quickly import them in. And so this is going to be /teacher. Let's get the /teacher controller. And we can basically pass it in right over here. And similarly, let us get the forgot what that one was called. It was a /teacher /student. I forget it was /student teacher controller. So let's actually put that in there as well. So let's put that in there as a controller. Terrific. So now what we can basically do is actually go ahead and make these requests. So we'll start from the beginning. Get all students by ID, create students, update student by ID. Now we can get all of our teachers. /teacher /the ID is get by ID, and then over here /student /teacher the teacher ID, and then /students. That's going to get all the students that belong to a teacher. And then lastly /student the teacher's ID /student, or sorry, /teacher the teacher ID /student student ID. That's going to update the student's teacher. So that right there is controllers. I know hopefully that wasn't too confusing. I know that was a lot. Hopefully I try my best to kind of explain it as well as possible. So hopefully everything is really clear. Now in the next section, what we're going to want to do is we're going to actually want to start extracting these IDs, because we're going to definitely need to use them in order to send back a proper response. So we're basically going to figure out how to do that through something known as request objects. So we're going to do that in the next section. Now that we have created the API routes, let's talk about a way to extract the important pieces of information from the request itself. Now, what am I talking about here? Well, let's look at this route right over here. This route is responsible for getting a specific student based on the student ID that we pass in as a param right over here. And so we need a way to actually extract the student ID, use that ID to get the correct student. Now, as a quick reminder, the actual route would look something like this. So localhost 3000/students and then / that student's ID that we're trying to get. So we basically need a way to extract this student ID from that request and use it in our function and eventually get the appropriate student. Now the param itself is not the only thing. We could also have things inside of our request body. For instance, when we want to create a student, we're going to pass data inside of the request body, and we need a way to extract that data and basically use that data to create that student. So over here, this is how the request body would look like when we want to create the student. It's going to have a name and then a teacher ID, because we're going to associate a student to a particular teacher. But again, we need a way to extract this out. Now, how do we do that? Well, we do that in Nest through request objects. So let's talk about that right now. Let's actually begin with this one right over here, where we extract the ID from this particular route. Okay, so this right here, so this route is basically being handled by this function right over here. And we need a way to get this student ID. Well, again, we're going to do that through request objects, and request objects are just decorators. So one quick thing, when we want to extract something from Express, typically we would have something like request, and then we would have response, and then over here we would probably do something like we destructure out the student ID from the request parameters. Now in Nest, the concept is actually a little bit different. In the parameters themselves, we actually specify what we want to get out, and then we can basically use that. So if we want to get out some parameters, then we get out some parameters using the request object that is param. If we want to get some body, then we'll use the body request object. Let me quickly explain what I mean by actually doing it. That will make more sense. So the first thing, let's say we want to get out some params. Well, we use this request object, and this is just a decorator. So in here, we basically say that, hey, from the request, we want to get the params. So we basically want to get the params. And we can basically say params. And we can give this param a type. Now, this is going to be of type object, and then it's going to have inside of that object a student ID that is a string. So now basically what we can do is use that param inside of our function. And to quickly illustrate this, let's actually just console.log the param. So we're going to console.log the param, and I'm going to call this params because we could have multiple parameters in there. Okay, so let's give this a quick save. And let's actually go ahead and make this request. So get student by ID. And remember, this is the ID right over here. Now, if I go to the console, you can see here that I have an object where the key is student ID, and then the string is, well, the ID itself. So that's terrific. And again, if you have multiple things inside of, if we have multiple params inside of our route, we would have a bigger object with everything else. Now let's say we just want to destructure out the student ID. We really don't need this object. So one thing, of course, that we can do is something like this. So we can just destructure it out, and we can say student ID. Well, there's actually a better way of doing that with Nest, and we actually don't have to do this extra layer of destructuring out. Inside of the param, we can basically ask for what we want. So we can say that we want the student ID. And then over here, this is not going to be the whole param object anymore. It's actually just going to be the student ID. So basically what we can do is call this student ID, and simply this is just going to be a string. So now what we can do is we can go ahead and save that. And now if I were to make this request again, you can see here that I'm console logging just the ID. All right, so this is terrific. This is awesome. So now we know how to extract basically the params from the request. Okay, so let's just quickly change this right now. So we're gonna change this to get student. We're gonna say with ID of, and then we're going to say student ID. And I'm going to get rid of this console.log because it's not really needed anymore. Okay, so now if I make this request, you can see here that we're getting the student with this ID. Now if I were to change this, of course, then you can see here that it changes accordingly. All right, terrific. Okay, so now let's start talking about the post request. So remember, the post request, the data is going to live inside of our body. So for this, we're going to use the body decorator. So body decorator. So similarly to the param, we can basically say that, hey, we want the body. We can call this body. And for now, I'm just not going to specify a type. Oops, we're not going to put this in the post decorator. We're going to put this in here in the actual function or method decorator. So, or in the parameters itself. So we're going to say here that we want the body. And basically the body, let's actually just quickly console.log it. And let's go ahead and let's send off this request. You can see here that we have a name of Ben Andro and then the teacher of this ID. All right, terrific. And again, we can always extract what we want. So for instance, if we want the name, we can change that to name and then change this back to name. And so if I were to send this off, you can see I just get the name. Now for the body, typically we get the whole body itself. We actually don't extract it out, and I'll actually show you why that is in a few sections from now. It's actually a pretty important pretty important concept in Nest, and actually it ties to the type of this particular body. Now I'm not defining the type, but we're gonna do that a little bit later on through something known as DTOs, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So okay, so now that we got the body, let's actually go ahead and let's just quickly change this. So we're going to create a student with the following data. And the data is going to be JSON.stringify and then the body itself. And the reason why we're stringifying it is just so it produces a nicer output when we actually try to output it over here in Postman. Okay, so that is great. Now let's actually do the put request. So the put request is pretty special because in the put request, we're gonna have data inside of the body as well as data inside of the params. So over here, we actually have kind of a double whammy. We have the body as well as the params. Well, this is very easy still. So all we really have to do is just param. And again, from the param, we want the student ID. And we can specify this as a string. We can specify that as a string. Okay, terrific. Oops, nope, that's not how it goes. Of course, we will have to define the variable and then specify that as a string. And then we also want the body. And we'll define the type of the body later, don't worry. So let's actually go ahead and change this. This one's going to be a little bit longer. And of course, we're not going to return strings. We're actually going to turn real responses a little bit later on. But for now, I just want to kind of illustrate this by just returning strings. So update student with ID of student ID with data of json.stringify, and then the body. All right. So now if we update the info, we can see here, update student with ID of this with this data right over here. Okay, so now it has come to the point where I highly encourage that you do the rest. So I highly suggest that you pause the video and basically do the rest over here. So for the get teachers, it's fine, we don't need anything, but for the get teacher by ID, we need to extract this from the params. For the get teacher by student ID, we actually have to extract two params. So we have to extract the teacher ID. We just have to extract the teacher ID. It's the put request that we're going to need to extract the teacher ID as well as the student ID. So this is the teacher ID, this is the student ID. Okay, so I highly suggest that you do it. If not, I'm gonna quickly do them right now. Okay, so let us go to let's close this off. Let's start with the teacher module. And in the teacher module, we're going to have our parameters, of course. So over here, we're going to do @param, and notice that it auto imported. And then this is going to be called teacher. I hate how this is so big. Teacher ID, and then we'll call it teacher ID, and this is a string. And we're just going to quickly change this to get teacher by or with ID of teacher ID. All right, terrific. So that should be it for that one. And then let's go to the student controller inside of the teacher directory. And then here, okay, here it's a little bit more complicated. So here actually we have the teacher ID. So in here we can basically specify the @param, and we can basically get that teacher ID. So teacher ID, which is going to be a string, of course. And then let's see here. Let's get all students that belong to a teacher, how about the teacher with, I don't know why I decided to capitalize all this, but it's too late now, with an ID of this. All right, so the absolute last thing that we need to do is this one. And this one, you might think it's complicated, but it's really pretty easy. And I bet you can probably figure out how to do this. We're gonna use the param twice. So let's actually just copy and paste this. So we're gonna get the param for the teacher, and we're also gonna get the param for the student. All right, so now last thing we have to really do is just update the text. And so we're gonna say update student with ID of, and then we're gonna say student ID to teacher with ID of teacher ID. All right, so terrific. So now we actually have a way of extracting data. Now there's actually a lot of different things that we can actually do. I highly suggest that you go to the Nest documentation to see exactly what you need. So let me quickly just zoom out of this and try to go back to the, right here. So inside of the controllers, you can see some of the different request objects that we have access to. For instance, we actually have access to the request, the whole request itself, and we can do that through the @request decorator. If we want the whole response, then we can do @response. If we want the next function that we're going to talk about actually when we deal with middleware, so don't have to worry about that, we can do @next. If we want the session, @session. Param, we talked about the param, we talked about the body. We can also do queries as well as headers. So sometimes we actually have maybe an authentication token in the header, and we need to have access to it. These other ones never really used @IP, but I mean, in niche cases where you have to use them, go ahead. That's how you do it. So in this crash course, we're really just dealing with these two as well as the next. But again, like you have the ability to extract the request header if you want to, or the request query. So that's pretty much it. Let's just quickly test that everything works. Okay, cool, that works, and that works, and I believe we tested all the other ones. All right, so that is request objects. Let's start talking about something known as data transfer objects, or DTOs for short. And to kind of explain them, let's go through an example right over here. Now, inside of the student.controller.ts file in the student directory, we have our post request. And the controller is extracting out the whole body from the request itself. And then once the controller extracts the body, what it's going to do is it's going to send off that body to something that is going to have all of the logic to manufacture and create that student. And so essentially this body is then going to be passed down to another component. Now the problem here is we don't really know the type of this body. That is something still very unknown to us. Now what we could potentially do is something like this. We can just do something like the body has a name of string and a teacher of string. So a name of string and a teacher of string. We could very well do this. Or we could even go the route of just extracting at body, and we could just extract the name. So we can extract the name, which is going to be the name, and then that will be the string, and then the same thing for the teacher. However, there's kind of a problem with this approach. The data will be consistently changing. It might change. For instance, now we want the name of the teacher, but later on we might want the grade. So we might also want the grade, which is a number. So we also might want this. So if we're doing this route, then we would have to add this type over here. If we're doing this route, then we would have to add another field. And then we would also have to manipulate it inside of our service as well, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But that's the thing that we're ultimately sending that body into. And that's not clean. That's not nice. We don't really want to do this. So instead of doing this, what we do is we create something known as data transfer objects. And these are just classes that really just define the type of the data that we are consistently going to be transferring to. Because we're going to be transferring the data from the request to the controller, and then the controller to something else. That something else is the services, which we'll talk about later. But we're consistently transferring the data, and that data might change. So it might be better to actually externalize how that data is going to look like through data transfer objects. And that's what we're going to be doing. So again, best way to actually learn about it is to just practically do it. So to create a data transfer object in the directory where you want to create the data transfer object in, then create a folder called DTO. So DTO. And then in here, we're going to create our data transfer object. So let's actually create the first data transfer object. We're actually going to create them for every single one. But we're also going to, let's start off with the post request, because that's the request that I made. So essentially here, what we're going to do is inside of this directory, we're going to create student.dto.ts. And in here, we're going to create a class. I'm getting some sort of error here. I guess I am getting an error. Let's see why that is. Right here. Oh, that's because I completely wiped out the body. It's definitely not what I want. Let's just put that right back in there. Cool. All right, so now I always forget. Don't put it in here. Put it in right here. There we go. Cool. Okay. So now inside of the student.dto.ts, what we're going to do is we're going to create a class. And we're going to call this class createStudentDTO. And this is basically going to be the body that we're going to need to create our student. And so over here, we can basically say that, hey, the name is a string and the teacher is also a string. So the name is a string and the teacher is also a string. And this is a class, so we don't have commas. It's actually just colons. Each line is separate. And then what we're going to do is we're going to just extract this out. And so now what we're going to do is inside of the student controller, we're going to import that DTO we're going to import that DTO, and that's inside of the exact same directory /DTO/student DTO. And where are we? And then, yeah, so this is going to be called the create student DTO. And essentially what we're going to ultimately do is we are going to define this body to be the create student DTO. All right, terrific. And then similarly, we're going to want to create a DTO for the body of the put request. Now you might say, okay, we could potentially use this body as well, but maybe later on in the future, what ends up happening is for the put and the create DTO, we have different needs and different requirements from the body. So we don't want to use this one over here, even though at this moment we are extracting both of the name and the teacher from the body. But again, later on in the future, we might not want to do that. So what we're going to do instead is just create another class. We're going to call this update body, update student DTO. We're going to save that. And notice that I haven't imported it in, but you can just auto import it by just straight up just using it. So we can just say update body. Actually, I guess that didn't work as well as I wanted to. Update student DTO. So I guess that was probably one of the reasons. Update student DTO. All right, terrific. So this is great. Now, one thing we also want to do is we want to define the type that the method is ultimately going to return. Right now, this method is returning a string, but ultimately it's not going to be doing that. For instance, here it's going to be returning this get students is going to be returning an array of students. So also in here, we're going to have to create a DTO for this. And this is going to be a DTO that sends back a response. So we can basically say something like export class, and then this is going to be find students response DTO. And then this is going to be, well, we're going to go ahead and actually we're going to change this to find student DTO. And then we're going to say that, hey, you get back the ID, which is a string. You get back the name, which is a teacher, or sorry, the name, which is a string as well. And a teacher, that is a string. There we go. Again, we can go ahead and just use this now. So over here, we could just say find student DTO. We can basically say that, hey, we're going to return back a student response, and this is going to be an array. Now, you're going to start getting some TypeScript errors because, well, we're returning a string, but we're expecting to return this. That's completely fine. We'll work on that a little bit later. Similarly over here, this is going to return just one student. So what we can basically do is say that, hey, we're going to return one student. This is ultimately the post request. It's going to return the student that we create. So that is going to be very similar. It's just going to be just one student. And then for the update student, we're also just going to return the student that we ultimately want to return. However, it actually might be a good idea to actually create a separate DTO for this as well. So let's actually create, if this isn't a find students, here we're just trying to find students. Here, this is just a student response for the post and the put request. So it might be a good idea to just have a separate DTO. And we're going to call this student response DTO. We're going to go ahead and save that, and let's go ahead and just import that in. Because again, these are just find student responses, where these are just student response DTOs. We're not really finding anything. So we can go ahead and just add that in there. Okay, cool. So now we actually have a lot of good typing, and you can see that TypeScript is yelling at us, which is good. This is ultimately what we want. And now we can basically pass this information from our request to our controller, from our controller to our service a lot easier. And if we ever need to change something, then we can just easily change it inside of the DTO. Okay, so that is pretty much it. Now if I do save this, I'm going to get a bunch of errors, and actually the code is not going to work. But now let's just quickly create DTOs for the teachers. So that is going to be the next step. And then what we're going to ultimately do is we're going to start fixing all these typing through services. So I highly recommend, again, as always, to pause this video and try it out on your own, because the best way to learn is to actually try it out and do it yourself. However, if you don't want to do it, then completely fine. I'm going to continue on and I'm going to start doing it right now. Okay, so let's begin. Let's just close everything off. So now you need to create the DTOs for the teachers. So the DTOs. So we're going to create a DTO file, a folder. And in here, we're going to create teacher.dto.ts. So teacher.dto.ts. And let's just begin with the teacher controller. Now the teacher controller is going to house basically the get teachers and then the get teacher by ID. Now over here we basically want very, very similar DTOs to the ones that we have created back in the student controller. So here we basically want a find teacher DTO response. And so let's actually go ahead and let's create that right now. Okay, so for the find teacher, what we're going to do is we're going to create a class. So we're going to do export class, and this is going to be we're just going to call this find teacher response DTO. So find teacher response DTO. And ultimately for the teacher, we're just going to return the teacher's ID as well as the teacher's name. So the teacher's ID as well as the teacher's name, which is a string. And so here, what we're going to do, so this is the find teacher DTO. So here what we're going to do is we're just going to copy this, and then we're going to import that in here. And this one's going to be relatively easy because there's nothing really in the request body or anything like that. So teacher, and so we're just going to define that, hey, this type is going to be an array of find teacher DTO response. And then similarly over here, this is just going to be 1, so we can go ahead and do that. Okay, so this is pretty great so far. So now let's actually work on the student controller. So the student controller, and this is actually going to be very, very similar to what we had before. We're actually going to recycle some of the DTOs that we have used, because this is ultimately just returning all of the students, even though it's returning all the students associated to a teacher. So now what we can do actually is just recycle some of the DTOs that we created inside of the student directory DTO. So the first one we're going to use is the find student response DTO, and as well as the student response DTO. So this is the find student response DTO, and so over here we're just going to say that, hey, this is ultimately going to return an array of this. And then for update, well, this is where we're going to use the student response DTO, because we're just going to return the student with their updated teacher. And so we can just return this. Okay, cool. So again, everything is basically on fire right now. Like everything is breaking, and that's really good, because that's ultimately what we want. We want TypeScript to tell us if we're not really defining or not really returning the correct data structure. And so this is really good. This is ultimately what we want. Okay, cool. So that is pretty much DTOs, and I hope that kind of clears it up. In the next section, we're actually gonna start fixing all of these errors through services. Let's start fixing those typing errors and send back responses that actually make a little bit more sense than the strings that we have been sending. Now, remember, the way to manufacture the response that we want to ultimately send is not going to be housed in the controller itself, but rather it's going to be housed in something else known as a provider, and that's going to contain all of the logic that is going to send back the response. For instance, if we want to send back all of the students, then we would have some sort of provider, or in this case, the provider is going to be called a service, and this service is going to get all of the students from our database or wherever we're storing them, do some sort of sanitization, whatever it is it has to do, and then send that data to the controller. And then the controller is going to send that to the client. So let's actually start doing that by creating our services. Now, if you want to learn more about providers, what you can do is you can go to the documentation, and essentially we're going to be using providers as a service. So over here we have there's multiple definitions of providers, but we can have services, we can have repositories, we can have factories, but we're going to be using services because services are going to be the thing that ultimately serves us and manufactures the data. So let's go ahead and let's do that right now. Now, a way to do that is we can actually go ahead and just create another service, but I'm going to use the Nest CLI. So I'm going to do nest generate and then service, and then I'm going to give the service a name. And the service is going to be, let's start off with the student. So it's going to be the student. And I'm also going to specify no spec so I don't get any of the test files. Alright, so now if I open up this directory, you can actually see that I have a student.service.ts. Alright, cool. So now in here, we're actually going to have all of the logic that ultimately serves these routes right over here. So these routes right here. So let's actually start off with the get student. Now let's actually just quickly examine the service itself. So you can see here we're getting this injectable decorator, and we're decorating it with we're decorating this student service with the injectable decorator. And this basically is important because essentially what it does is it marks this class as a provider, and that's very important because it provides it with the necessary metadata. All right, cool. So let's actually go about doing this right now. So let's create the service that ultimately is going to return all of the students. Now, to return all of the students, we need to have the students somewhere stored, maybe in a database. So maybe you can use Postgres or MongoDB. This is not a database course, so we're not going to use any sort of database or ORM. We're just going to simply, very easily, just create a database.ts file inside of our source directory, and this is going to be our source of data. Now, to get the data, you can just go to my crash course right over here, my GitHub page, Nest crash course, and go to the main branch, and then just go to source, and then go to db.data, and I have just a bunch of student data and as well as some teacher data. So I can just go ahead and copy this and then just paste it in there. Alright, so now let's actually start creating the service that is ultimately going to return all of the students. So this one's relatively easy actually. So let's go about doing this one right now. So the student service. So the first thing that we're going to do is this is going to be a method that we're ultimately going to call. So this is a method that we're ultimately going to call. And typically, this method is actually exactly the same as the method that we have inside of our controller. So we can basically do get students, and then over here we can have all of the logic to get all of our students. Now this one's going to be relatively easy because, well, we're just getting all of the students straight up. Now what we're going to do here is we're actually inside of the class, we're going to get this data over here and just put it inside of this class. So we're going to do something like students is equal to, and let's export out the students from the database. So we're going to export out the students from the database. We're going to say students is equal to students. So now we basically have access to, this dot students. So this dot students, and this is just basic, just classes and object-oriented programming. Essentially, here we can basically inside of our method we have access to the students because, well, this is inside of the class itself. Now, one thing that we could do with TypeScript is say that, hey, we don't have access to this particular property outside of the class itself. So if I were to ever instantiate this for some reason, if I were to do const, I don't know, students is equal to new student service. So if I were to do that right now, if I were to do student, and actually just change this text, actually just to clarify this, if I were to do student dot, I would actually get students. And I would really never, ever really need to get the students. I want all of this to be handled by our methods. So what I could possibly do is just say private. And then that way, now we can only say get students. And we can't really say, you know, get, so x.getStudents rather than x.students. Okay, cool. All right. And we could also mark this as read only if we didn't ever want to manipulate this, but we are ultimately going to manipulate it, so we're not going to mark it as read only. So there we go. We have created our first service. So now what we can do is we can actually use this service inside of the controller. Now to do that, what we're going to have to first do is basically go to our app module and tell our root application about the service itself. So we have to tell our application that, hey, we have a service and the service is a provider ultimately. And we can basically import that. So let's go ahead and import the service that we have created. So let us go to, this is app student, where do we put this? Right here, service. And then we're gonna call this, well, we already called it student service. And we would basically pass that in there. And I'll show you why that's important right now actually. So to actually be able to use the service in the controller, what we ultimately have to do is actually put it inside of our constructor. So we can basically have a constructor right over here. And basically inside of the constructor, what we can have is the basically the student param. And so we can basically mark this as private if we want, because we're not ever going to use it outside of this class. We're also going to say read only for this. So private read only. And we can say student service. So how in the world is it going to know that, hey, this student service is relating to this class right over here? Well, it's going to know once I define the type of this variable right over here. And the type of this variable is going to be, well, student service. So if I go ahead and I define the type of it, if I say student service, and notice how it auto imports, it actually knows that I'm basically using this class right over here. So now what I could actually do is I can do something like this dot student service and then dot get student, and it actually knows about it, which is terrific. This is great. And the reason why it knows about it is because I actually injected it inside of the provider. And that's the only reason why it knows about it, because really here we're just defining a type. It doesn't really define everything that's inside it, but it knows about it because we injected it inside of the provider. Okay, terrific. And so one thing that we actually have to do now, and we actually unfortunately won't be able to test this because TypeScript is, we're gonna have to fix all the TypeScript errors beforehand. But one thing that we also have to do is we should probably define ultimately the type that we're going to be returning. And this is going to be the exact same type that we defined over here. So we can basically do that. And let's just auto import it in, and there we go. Cool. All right, so that is the get students. Now let's actually go ahead and let's do the same thing for the get student by ID, and then get the post, and then get the update the student. So this might be a little bit tedious, but hopefully this kind of makes a little bit more sense. So to do this, we're gonna have to create another service. And what's great now is because we have created a service that extracts all the logic, our controller is just responsible for getting the request and sending back a response. And right now it might seem like, okay, well, we could have done that exact same line, but for the more complicated ones, trust me, you can see how it actually separates the concerns a lot better. Okay, so let's begin with get student by ID. So get student by ID. And what this is going to do is it's going to take in a student ID, or you know what, we'll just call this, we'll call it student ID. So this is going to be student ID, and this is a string. And ultimately what it's going to return, and this is going to return just one student. So we can basically do something like this dot students dot find, and we can basically say that, hey, we want to return student.id triple equals student ID. All right, so that's really all we're doing. And let's actually define the type of this as well. So let's go here and let's define the type of this as one student. Okay, cool. So now what we can basically do is we can just go here and then we can just say this dot student service, and then we can do get student by ID, and we can pass in that student ID to that param. Okay, cool. So that fixes that. So now let's do the create student. So let's go here. Let's create the create student service. And so now in here we're going to basically have the body, and we're going to call this the payload for us. And so remember, this is going to be the body ultimately of the student itself. Now let's actually define the type of this. This is going to be called the create student DTO. Notice I also auto imported it, and it's going to return, well, the student response. So it's going to return the student response DTO. And for some reason, did it auto import? Okay, no, the reason why it's failing is because, well, we're not returning that right now. We're just returning undefined. Okay, cool. So now ultimately what we want to do is we want to create that student and push it into our database. So let's actually do new student. So new student is equal to an object. And the new student is going to have an ID that we're going to automatically generate, as well as the name and the teacher ID that is inside of this payload. So one thing that we could do is we could just destructure out this payload, but we do still have to manufacture the ID somehow, some way. So we still have to do that. Now, I like to do that through a library called UUID. So I can just do a quick npm install UUID, and it's just going to create a bunch of UUIDs for us. Okay, so now what we can do is we can just import from UUID, and we can basically import, I'm going to import a specific hash function or whatever this thing is that creates a UUID called v4. And I'm going to say that, hey, as UUID, so I can just call it UUID. So now what I can basically say is call UUID to just generate a random UUID. All right, so this is the new student, but now ultimately what we want to do is we want to push it into this, this right over here into our database. So we're gonna do this dot students dot push, and we're gonna push in the new student. So we're gonna push in the new student, and then ultimately we're going to return the new student. Okay, cool. So now inside of the controller, what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of this, and we're simply just going to call this dot student service dot create student, and we're going to pass in the body. That's it. So again, look how simple the controllers are. They're really simple. All right, last thing is update the student. So this one's going to be a little bit trickier. So let's actually go ahead and do that right now. So we're going to call this update student, and this is going to take in a payload of update student DTO. And then we're also going to take in a student ID that is a string. This is in the params itself. All right, so this one's a little bit more complicated. So let's actually, let's define this right here. So ultimately what we're gonna want to do is we're going to return the updated student. So we're going to return the updated student. So let's actually just declare that. And let's just say this is of type student response. So student response DTO, because that's ultimately what we're going to return. And now let's actually do a let's actually get the updated student list. So I know we're only updating one, but we're ultimately going to want to update that one inside of our database. So what we can do is we can just basically update that one and then get all of the others inside of an array. So we can basically say updated student list, and that is going to be equal to this dot students dot map, because this is going to create the function for, or the array for us. However, and then we can modify certain things if we want to. And we can basically say student I hate these big things that just come up. There we go. So now we can basically say here, we can basically do the check. We can basically just say if student.id is equal to ID, and the ID is passed in over here as the student ID, so we can basically say that. Then what we can return, or what we can do, is we can basically say that, hey, the updated student is equal to, so the updated student is equal to the student ID. So the ID is still going to be the student ID, and the but the name and the teacher is going to be determined by the payload. So the name and the teacher is going to be determined by the payload. And then over here, we're just going to do else, and then we're just going to return the student itself because we don't want to manipulate that particular student. So now what we can do is just simply say this dot students is equal to updated students. And so that's going to return a list of all of the students and the updated one as well. Now this is failing for some reason. So, oh, nope, updated student list, not updated student. This is why I love TypeScript. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to return the updated student. So we're going to return that updated student. Cool. So now if I go back to the student controller, very simply, what I could do is just do this dot update student. And then we're going to, this dot student service dot update student, and then we're gonna pass in the body, and then we're also gonna pass in the student ID. Cool. So that's pretty much it. So that right there is the service. So let's actually go ahead and let's do this for the teachers as well. So the teachers, very simple. So let's actually create another service. So we're going to do nest, and then we're going to new nest generate, and then we're going to generate a service for the teacher, and we're going to specify the no spec flag. So let's do that right now, and let's wait. There we go. So now inside of the teacher, we should have a service as well. So let's go about creating this service, and notice it's exactly the same. We have the injectable decorator, which is pretty cool. Okay, so in here, let's actually just quickly get rid of some of these other services or some of these other files. And let's open this up. So we want to get the teachers. So let's have a get teacher. So we're gonna have a get teacher service. And in here, what we're gonna do is we're just gonna simply return all the teachers. So let's actually put the variable over here. So private teachers is equal to teachers from our database. And let's actually extract this out a little bit properly from our database. Cool. And so now what we can basically simply do for this one is just return this dot teachers. And then let's define the type as well. So find teacher DTO, and this is going to be an array entry of that. Okay, cool. So that is that. Let's just create the other service as well. So get teacher by ID, and then this is going to be teacher ID, and then string, and this is going to return find teacher DTO, and then we're just going to return this dot teachers dot find, and then we're gonna do teacher, and then ultimately we're just gonna do teacher dot ID is equal to teacher ID. So teacher dot ID is equal to teacher ID. That's pretty much all that we're doing. Okay, cool. So now, well, again, to use this service, we actually have to tell our root component or root module about it. So we can just say teacher service, or service. And then in here, we can basically inject that inside of our constructor. So we can say private read only, and then we can say teacher service, and then ultimately we can basically import in teacher service. Notice again we auto imported it. So now what we can do is we can do this dot teacher service dot get teacher, call it, we're done. And then similarly over here we can do this dot teacher service dot get teacher by ID, call it, pass in the parameter which is the teacher ID, and then we're completely done. All right, so the absolute last thing that we have to do is we have to create essentially the service for the students as well. Now inside of the student controller, inside of the teacher directory. Now this right here, we can actually just use the student service that we created inside of the student directory. So we actually don't have to create another service. We can actually use this same service because again, this service is just handling anything really student related. So we can just use this exact same service, which is pretty cool. And so in here, we're gonna actually have to have the logic that allows us to, in here we're gonna have the logic that allows us to basically create these two routes as well. So let's go about doing that right now. Let's begin with the first route that allows us to, inside of the controller, get students, but all students that belong to a specific teacher. So in here, let's actually create that service all the way down here. And so this service is going to be called, let's see what we're going to call this. We're going to say get students. So we're going to do get students by teacher ID. And so here we're going to take in the teacher ID, which is a string, and ultimately we're going to return the find teacher response DTO, which is an array entry, so all the students. And so here what we're going to do is we're just going to do return this dot students, and we're going to filter out all of the students that don't have the ID that we've specified here. So we're going to filter by all the students that have this ID. So we're going to say student dot teacher, because remember the teacher is the UUID. So let's just quickly illustrate how the data looks like. So all students have a teacher that has an ID. So you can see here all of the students have a teacher that have an ID. And basically what I'm going to do is if I want to get all the students for Miss Jackson, I'm basically going to go ahead and just filter for all the students that have this exact same UUID. So Miss Jackson has Anthony Cole, Michael Bryant, Kobe Jordan, and I think Mr. Wade has the other two. Okay, so that's basically all this is doing. This is a relatively easy one. So let's actually go ahead and let's use this. Now to use it, again, we have to inject it inside of our constructor. So let's inject that into our constructor. So we're going to say private read only, and then we're going to say student service, and then we're going to call this student service. And let's just fix the import. I hate when it does this. So inside here, inside right here. Cool. All right, so now what we can basically do is again get rid of this and just do this dot student service dot, we're gonna get student by teacher ID. We're gonna pass in the teacher ID, and it's not happy for some reason. Let's actually hover over it. So it says that find is not type find is not assignable. Oh, okay. All right, so this is find student, but over here I said find teacher. Okay, cool. Apologies for that. There we go. Now the type is good. All right, the last service that we need to create is one that updates the student. So let's actually create that right over here. So the last one is we're going to call this update student teacher. And this is going to be it's going to take in the teacher ID, which is a string, as well as the student ID, which is also a string. Ultimately, it's going to send back that that student that we ultimately updated. So that's just one student. So we can just say student response DTO. And then over here, we're really just gonna have very similar logic to what we did when we first updated our students. So let's just copy this and let's just paste it in here, and we'll just do a little bit of changing. So this is still gonna be the same. And then over here, we're still going to map through everything, and we're going to check if the student ID is equal to the student ID that was provided in the parameter. Now, the only difference here is that the student is ultimately going to stay the same. Their ID and their name is going to stay the same. We're not going to update that. We're only updating the teacher, and we're going to update the teacher to the teacher ID that we provided in the parameter. So that's ultimately really what we're doing. Other than that, it's exactly the same. So now what we can do is, well, let's get rid of this. Now what we can do is we can basically save this. Again, go over here, and then just do this dot student service, and then we can basically update our student teacher. And again, we would have to provide the teacher as well as the student ID. Now, just let me quickly remind myself. First, we want the teacher ID, because of course the parameter order matters, and then that's it. Okay, so now if we go back over here, everything is working fine, which is great because all the typing errors are fixed. So let's actually test this out in Postman. Where do I have Postman? Okay, so let's test this out in Postman. Getting all the students. It gets all of the students. Cool. So that works. Get student by ID. So now we're providing a specific ID. And it seems like that works. So now we get Cole Anthony. Let's create a student. So now we're creating this student with this teacher. So we get back that student. And now if I do get all students, notice that, okay, the last student is Kendrick Jenner. You can see here that we get Ben Andro, which is the last one. Let's also update a student. So we're updating a student name, or update student info. So here's the student ID that we're ultimately updating, and this is going to relate to this first student, Cole Anthony. And we're updating their name to Heather Andrews for some reason. So you can see here that we get back this response. Now if I were to get all the students, for some odd reason this is null. Huh, that is pretty strange actually. Why is that? I'm actually a little flustered. I'll have to see exactly. It's probably something wrong with our logic, yeah, for some reason this is ultimately returning null. It's probably something wrong with our logic. It's probably actually something to do with the mapping. So let's actually let's try to fix it right now. If not, I'll pause the video and fix it later. So let's go to the student service, and ultimately here, okay, cool, yeah, because we're not returning. So we're basically declaring it, but we're not returning anything. So what we have to do is just return the student, the updated student. And actually also didn't do that here, so we would get the same exact error. So we actually have to return it. That's why it's null. So if I were to, let's do this again now. I always forget where I leave Postman. So again, so let's just get this off. So now we got Cole Anthony. If I were to update that and then go back over here, you can see here that Heather Andrews is fine. Okay, cool. So good thing I didn't have to pause the video. Get all teachers. We get all of our teachers. Get teachers by specific ID, passing the ID in the param. Okay, cool. So that works. All right, so now we want to get teachers. So get all the teachers that belong to a specific student. So this is getting all the teachers that belong to, I'm not sure which teacher this is, but it definitely has a lot of students. So let's just quickly check here that this logic works. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 students. Do we also have 5 students here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it seems like all the students are associated to that particular teacher. I'm not sure if that's the way that I architected it or not, but is fine for now. And then we can also update a particular student to a particular teacher as well. So if I were to get all the students for that, I'm not really sure actually if this logic is working properly or not. So let's actually update. So let's just figure out exactly. Actually, no, the teacher IDs are different. So I should get all of the teacher IDs for this one. I shouldn't be getting Kendrick Jenner. So the logic for this is actually flawed and it's not working. So let's try to fix that right now. So what it's doing is it's returning. That's so funny. Okay, so we're just returning. We're not really doing any checks here. So what we have to do is you have to return student.teacher is equal to the teacher ID. That's what we have to do, and that's why we weren't getting any of the conditions. So now if I were to send this request off, you can see we actually only get 3 because only 3 students are associated to that teacher. Okay, cool. So we learned about services. I know this was a very long one, but in the next section, we're actually going to start working on a way to actually validate our requests and validate basically if the data that we're getting back is valid. And we're actually going to do that through pipes and middleware. So stay with me because we're going to learn about these in the next section. Let's explore a new concept in Nest known as pipes. And pipes are a way of validating data and transforming data. Let me show you what I mean by going to the Nest documentation. So it says here that a pipe is a class annotated with the @injectable decorator. Okay, that's fine. Let's start just talking about exactly what the use cases for pipes are. So there's 2 typical use cases. We have transformation, and so transforms the input data to the desired form. So we can transform it from a string to an integer. And this could be very, very desirable, especially if we're using some sort of SQL database that stores the ID as a number. So let me just kind of quickly illustrate this. Right now we're using a UUID, which is a string. But let's say we were using some sort of SQL database that was basically storing the ID as a number. However, if you know basic JavaScript or basic Express, the param will always be returned as a string. So what we actually can do is just transform this string into a number automatically without us doing any parse int or any parse float through pipes. And I'll show you exactly how to do that in this example. Another thing that we can do, and which we will do in our section, is validation. So essentially we can validate the input data, and if it passes, then okay, we go through. However, if it fails, then we throw an exception. And this is actually what we're going to be doing in our example. And there's actually a built-in type, or built-in pipe rather, that will validate whether the param itself is a valid UUID. So UUIDs have a structure that they have to have in order to be, well, UUIDs. So there's actually valid UUID forms and then forms that are not even UUIDs. And to kind of illustrate this, we can just go to UUID validator and we can paste in that UUID that we had. Well, this is a valid UUID. However, if I remove this 3 and thus decrease the length of this UUID, you can see that this is not a valid UUID. Now if I put a 4, okay, that's a valid UUID. What if I decrease this and then I increase that? Well, that's not a valid UUID. A UUID has a structure imposed, like a very strict structure. And what we can do is validate if the param is a actual valid UUID. Because if it's not a valid UUID, then no user is going to be associated with that UUID, and thus there's no point of continuing on. And so we can actually use a pipe to quite easily accomplish this. Now, in Nest, there's a few built-in pipes. We got the validation pipe, we have the parse int pipe, we have parse boolean pipe, parse array pipe, and then we have the parse UUID pipe, which this is the one that we're ultimately going to be using. And then there's some other pipes. Let me just kind of quickly illustrate how we use the a parse int pipe to actually transform a input from a string to a number. Let me just quickly illustrate that, and then we'll go ahead and use the parse UUID pipe. So inside of here, inside of the parameters, we have the @param and then the ID. Now this ID is going to be different than our ID. It's probably just going to be some sort of number rather than a UUID. And so what we want to ultimately do is parse it into a string, or sorry, parse it into a number. Well, automatically it's going to be a string, but if we actually pass the parse int pipe, it's going to automatically parse it to a number. So you can see here that this is of type number. And okay, now if you call something like this, obviously this is not a number. So what it will do ultimately is actually throw an error response. And this is great. This is actually what we want. We want to throw an error response if we get something like this, if we will have numbers. So this is one thing that we can do. We can also handle the responses any way that we want. We can basically error HTTP status code, and we can give our information that we desired. And that's basically how pipes work. They're really, really easy. Now, we are going to use the UUID pipe, and this UUID pipe is simply just going to check if this is a valid UUID. If it's not a valid UUID, it's just going to go ahead and throw an error, throw an exception. And you know, this actually works with all the other pipes as well. So in the documentation, you can see here, yeah, so I'm not sure exactly where in the documentation it says it, but the other pipes work in a very, very similar way. So you can basically kind of use this parse array pipe to ensure that, hey, you're actually getting back an array, or parse a bool pipe to ensure that you're getting back a boolean. Okay, that is awesome, possum. So let's actually go ahead and use this pipe right now. And this is going to be a very, very easy and quick section. Let's actually remove this DTO. Seems like we're not using it. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close everything off. And I'm going to start, of course, as I usually do, with the students. The student controllers. Okay. So we are going to be using the parse UUID pipe, and we're going to be using that in order to validate the params. So we're going to validate this param over here because this should be a valid UUID, as well as this one. Okay, cool. So how do we do that? Well, from here, from the @NestJS common, you can just say parse UUID pipe. And very, very easily, all we have to do is just pass this as a second parameter. So we're going to call new parse UUID pipe, because remember, this is a class, and that's it. That's literally all we have to do. And let's actually just test this out right now. Okay, so let's go back to our code. Now this should be fine. We should be able to get that particular user, Cole Anthony. Now if I were to provide an invalid UUID, so let's decrease the length of it by 1. Now we're to pass this, you can see here that I actually get an exception. And the exception is validation failed, UUID is expected, which is great. This is definitely what we want. Alright, so let's just quickly do the rest. This is going to be very, very easy. It's just going to be a bunch of copying and pasting. So this section is going to be very quick. Over here, we can do that as well. If we have anything that we want to pass in here, we can do that as well. But we'd have to extract the body. But there's nothing really in the body. I guess maybe other than the teacher ID. So we could do that, but that's it might get a little ridiculous. So let's not do that. So let's go here and let's validate the student. So over here, let's get rid of this put. Seems like we're not using it. So let's do parse. We're parsing the UUID pipe. Again, all we really have to do now is just call it. Very, very easy. Just call it and we are done. So we're done with this. Last but not least, we need to do it here. So new parse UUID pipe. Notice that it probably auto imported, and it did. Terrific. Let's call that, and then let's just copy this. And let's just paste that in there, and let's paste that in there. Okay, done and dusted. So now let's just quickly give this a quick test. So again, invalid, let's get rid of that. Invalid gives us an exception. If I provide an invalid UUID here, should also throw an exception. Awesome. If I go to get teacher by ID, will it throw an exception? Yep, absolutely. Terrific. Get teacher. So if I have an invalid teacher, throws an exception. And then for the last one over here, if this is invalid, then throw an exception. If it's valid, of course, it's going to work. And then if I change this student, we get an exception. That's terrific. That's really great. And let's just close all these off. And that's ultimately what we want. We want this kind of quick and easy error handling. All right, so that's pretty much it for this section. In the next section, we're going to be talking about modules. In this section, we are going to be exploring modules. And we've already seen modules through the app.module.ts. I keep referring to this as the root of the application. And we end up using this app module inside of this main.ts, which basically bootstraps our Nest application. But what exactly are modules? If I go over here, modules are a way to really organize our components, and a Nest application will at least have one module, and that is the root module. And that's basically kind of the source of truth that takes all of the code that we want inside of our Nest application, and it basically displays that and creates our Nest application through that. But it is actually really important and highly recommended to create multiple modules for each component of your application to truly organize your architecture. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to create a module for the student as well as the teacher. And you might not really know what modules do, but I'll try to explain them as well as I can by essentially coding them out for you. So let's begin with the student. So what we could potentially do is just simply go to our Nest CLI and just do nest generate. And this time we want to generate a module, and this is going to be the student module. So let us wait a little bit. Actually, this might not even be a nest command. I'm not sure why it's hanging. Oh, it created. Okay, there we go. Okay, cool. So there we go. We have generated our module, and you can see that our module is decorated with the @module decorator right over here. And then we have just a simple class. And this is just typically how Nest components are built, through classes. All right, so now that we have our module, what we're going to do is we're going to start exploring the app.module.ts. You can see here that we have something called imports that we're not really using. We will actually in a bit. But then we're specifying all of the controllers of the application as well as all of the providers. Well, let's actually do that for the student.module.ts. And here, we're not going to just specify every single controller in the application as well as every single provider in the application. We want to really separate and organize our components. So in the student.module.ts, we will only specify the controllers and services that are essentially being used by this inside of this student directory. So this controller as well as the service. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So we would do that inside of this object that was already kind of pre-built for us. And you can see we can specify the controllers. So here we can specify that we have a student service. Or this should be a student controller. And then for our providers, and I should have a comma here, that's why it's not auto-completing. For our providers, this is also going to be an array. And over here, we're going to have the student. So we're going to have the student service. Okay, and that's great. That's pretty much all we have to do. Now let's create a provider, or a module rather, for the teacher. So nestg teacher, and then nest generate, and we want to generate a module, and we want to generate a teacher module. So we can put that in there. I don't know why it's taking so long these days, but hopefully in like 10 seconds it's going to generate it, and it did. Cool. Okay, so now in here we're going to create our teacher module. And so what we're going to be doing is creating the controller, and this is only going to have the controllers that we have specified here. Note that we actually have 2 controllers, so we're going to be using the teacher controller as well as the student teacher controller. So we're going to have 2 controllers here, as well as 1 provider, which is just the teacher service. Okay, cool. So now what we can do, and this is why this is really important, we're basically defining all of the controllers and all of the services that are associated to that particular component. But now what we can do, instead of defining every single controller inside of our app.module.ts, as well as every single provider, what we can do is simply get rid of all this and just import the 2 modules into our app.module.ts. And that's really all we have to do. So we can actually get rid of all this. And what it's going to do is it's also going to start using the controllers as well as the so it's going to use the controllers as well as the services automatically, because those modules are using those controllers and those services. So over here we can just say teacher module, and then we can also say student module. All right, pretty much it. Really easy. So now if I were to save this, let's go ahead and I just want to see where I'm running my application. I think it's over here. And you can see we're getting an exception, and I was actually expecting this exception. And this exception is basically saying that, hey, this student service, it's not really known in the teacher module. We don't know about this in the teacher module. And that makes sense, because before what we were doing is we're basically defining all of the providers inside of the root module, but now we're not. Now what we actually have to do is define the provider inside of, well, the teacher module as well. So we actually have to define the student service in here. Now, one thing that we can do instead actually is go to the student controller or student.module.ts that contains the student service. And what we can do is we can export that student service, because hey, that student service is needed. So that student service is really important. All right, so that still doesn't tackle the problem that, hey, the teacher module requires the student service. And if you don't remember why it requires the student service, is because of this right over here in the student.control.ts inside of the teacher module, where we're basically using that student service right over here. So now what we can do is we can say, okay, well, here what we want to do is we want to import the student module. So we import the student module, which automatically exports the service, and you can see here that everything is fine. And you can see that inside of our app.ts, all we really have to do is import the modules. Obviously, as our application get bigger and bigger, so will this array, but it's actually better than putting all of the services as well as all of the providers, which will make this component huge. And so this is a really good way of separating out our concerns. And just to double check, everything is business as usual. Everything still works. Cool. In this last section, we are going to cover how we can use middleware inside of a NestJS application. Now, middleware is not a unique concept to NestJS. It is used throughout every single backend application, regardless of the language, regardless of the framework. It is very, very common practice to utilize middleware. And that's why it's so important to learn how to utilize middleware inside of a NestJS application. And to kind of quickly explain exactly what middleware are, I have this nice little diagram. So typically what we would do is we would make a request. The client would make a request, and in our Nest application, it would go to the controller or our route. So the request would go to the controller. The controller would then call the provider, which is the service, and then it would send back the response to the client, not back to the request itself. It would actually send it back to the client. So I hope that makes sense. Now, if we add a middleware, it kind of acts as a middleman. So what happens is the client makes a request, and then the request doesn't go straight to the route. It actually goes to the middleware. And then the middleware has some sort of information, it processes that request. And if everything is fine and dandy, then it goes to the route, or the controller in this case. And then the controller obviously does the business logic and then ultimately sends off the response back to the client. And so why do we need this middleman? Well, we need this middleman when we have a lot of repetitive code. For instance, let's say we had a lot of repetitive code that we use throughout every single route. Let's say we had 5 routes and we had a lot of repetitive code. Let's say, for instance, we were validating if the UUID actually belonged to a particular user. So not if the UUID itself is valid, but what we want to do is we'll validate if the UUID even belonged to a particular user. And if they didn't, then just don't even pass it to the controller. Just don't even continue. Well, we would do that through middleware. And then we can basically apply this middleware through every single route that we want it to be applied for. Another reason why we would want to use middleware is maybe we want to make sure that, hey, the client is actually authorized to make this request. So again, we can make a request, but maybe we're not authorized to make that request. Maybe we're not logged in, or maybe we are logged in, but we don't have like premium access, so we can't make that particular request. Well, we can have a middleware that basically checks that for us. Another way we can have a middleware is other error handling kind of related things. And also the middleware can sanitize our data and actually inject data inside of the request so that the controller can easily use it. For instance, if we are basically trying to log in through a JSON web token, for instance, the middleware can basically parse that JSON web token, figure out what the user is, and then put that user data inside of the request. And that way now the controller doesn't even have to parse that JSON web token. It can just take that user data from the request. And that's why middleware is really, really important. Now in NestJS, middleware are very, very, very easy to implement. So you can see here, a middleware is just a class. It's just a class that we're going to create. And then what we're going to do is we're going to inject that class inside of a module. So we're going to inject that class inside of a module. And you can read through the documentation if you want to, but I'm just going to go ahead and do it. And so hopefully that just kind of clears up any sort of confusion. And hopefully maybe you won't even have to read the documentation, even though I highly always recommend reading the documentation because I never cover everything in the documentation. All right, to create middleware, what we're going to do is we're going to create a directory. And I like to call this directory common. And this is where I like to put a lot of my common things that I'm ultimately going to be using throughout my application. Now inside of here, I'm going to create another directory called middleware. So I'm going to create another directory called middleware. And then inside of the middleware, I am going to create a valid student.middleware.ts. And essentially what this middleware is going to do is it's going to get that UUID and basically check, hey, does this UUID actually belong to a particular student? If they don't, then don't bother sending the request to the controller. So that's basically what this is going to do. But you can have multiple different middlewares. Again, you can use middleware for authentication, even though in NestJS, it's actually better to use guards for authorization as well as authentication. But, or actually, I think it's just authorization that it specifies here. So this is often referred to authorization is traditionally handled with middleware and request, but it's actually kind of better to do it with guards. However, we won't be covering guards because they're not that common in NestJS applications, so we're just going to be doing middleware. All right, so let's create our first middleware. Now remember, a middleware is just a class. And so we're going to be creating a class, and we're going to be to create this class, what we're going to be doing is using the we're going to basically be decorating it with injectable. So we're going to do @import, and this is going to be from @the nest common, and then we're going to mark this with injectable. So we're going to get this injectable. Okay, and so this is going to be the class. So let's go ahead and just export this class. And we're going to call this valid student middleware. So valid student middleware. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do @injectable. And so we're going to mark it with injectable. All right, and you can read about the documentation to learn more about injectable, but this is needed to mark this as a middleware. Okay, cool. So now what we're going to do is to truly mark it as a middleware, because the injectable can be used for services as well. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to essentially use another, not really a decorator, but another variable here called nest middleware. And then in this class, we would say valid student middleware, and then implements nest middleware. And that truly defines it as a middleware. Now you can see that it's failing right now, and that's because, hey, this class is not configured properly. And that's because middleware always needs to have a use method. So a use method. And inside of this use method, we are going to have the request, and we can actually annotate that this is a request by importing it from Express. So we can import the type request from Express. And remember, even though we didn't install Express directly, Nest is built on top of Express, so it's going to have it. So Express, we can get the response, as well we can get the next function. So if you don't know what the next function is, I'll kind of inform you in a bit. So we have our rec. We're also going to have our response. And then we're going to have our next function. So next function. All right, so here we have the use. Now in here, we're just going to have our logic. We're just going to have our simple logic. So if the user is actually valid and that ID actually corresponds to an actual user, then what we're going to do is we're going to say that, hey, what we want you to do is move on. Where are we here? Move on to the next thing. And the next thing for us is going to be the controller. Also, the next thing for us could be another middleware. But for here, it's going to be a controller. And that's where we're going to use the next function. But if everything is not okay, if that UUID doesn't correspond to an actual user, then what we want to do is we want to throw an error. Okay, so let's try this out. So let's say const student ID, and we're going to get the student ID from the rec.params.student_ID. So we're going to get that student ID from the rec.params, because we're going to use this middleware with any request that basically has the student ID in its parameters. And then what we're going to do is let's actually go ahead and let's just import the data from our database. So basically the student data. We would probably use some sort of ORM if we were using an actual database. But for us, we're just going to import students from, let's see here, where is it? What directory is it? Right here. From database, we're just going to import students. And what we're going to do is we're going to find if a student actually exists inside of this database with a student ID of this that was inside of the rec.param. So what we can basically do here is we can do something like const student exists, and then we can do students. We can parse through the students, and then instead of using map or something like that, we can use something like sum. And the sum method, basically what it does is it returns true or false. It returns a boolean, and it will return true if any one of the students that we've iterated over pass a certain condition that we specify. Only one have to pass that condition for it to return true. However, if none of them pass the condition, it returns false. So that's what the sum method is doing. And so the condition is basically going to be student.id is equal to student ID. That's literally the condition. And so now what we're going to say is, hey, if the student doesn't exist, so we're going to say student exists, but then we're going to say not, so not student exists. What we're going to do is we're going to just throw an error. Now, how do we throw an error in Nest? Well, we do this through the HTTP exception. So HTTP exception. So HTTP exception. And what this is going to do is it's going to throw an error for us. We can basically throw new HTTP exception. We can specify a method, so student not found, and then we can say that, hey, this is a 400 error. Now, if we pass this, if we don't call this if statement, then what we're going to do ultimately is call the next function. And the next function is going to go ahead and move on to the controller. And so that's basic middleware. Now, how do we use the middleware for the routes that we want? For instance, we're going to want to use this middleware for this and for this, as well as for the other ones. Like we could use it for put as well, for sure, because that's also part of the param. For now, I'm just going to inject it for these two right over here, just for simplicity's sake. Now, how do we do that? Well, we go to the module that's basically housing the controllers that are associated to these things. So that would be the student module. And then in here, very simply, what we do is we start manipulating the class itself. So what we actually do here is we say class student module, and then what we're going to do is we're going to say that, hey, this implements Nest module. Notice that it auto imported Nest module in here. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to add additional configuration to the student module. And so we can actually specify the configuration with the configure method. So the configure method. So without this Nest module, we wouldn't have been able to do it. It doesn't really throw an error, but again, with this implement Nest module, we can actually go ahead and configure our student module the way that we want it. And so now we can basically say, hey, we want to use this middleware. Now, how do we say that, hey, we want you to use this middleware? We can do that through something known as a consumer. So we can basically say consumer, and essentially this consumer is going to be passed into this configure. And this consumer is going to be of a special type. And this consumer is going to be of type middleware consumer. Middleware consumer. Notice again how it auto imported right over here. And so now what we can say is that, hey, we want to basically use this consumer.apply, and then we want to apply the middleware that we just created. Valid student middleware. Again, auto imported. I don't like how it auto imported it, so I'm just gonna import this one myself. So this is in the common directory /middleware/valid student middleware. So we're gonna basically consume this middleware, but for which routes are we going to consume them for? Well, we want to consume them for these two routes over here. So we would just say for routes, or for routes, and then basically here we would specify the path of the route that we want this middleware to be consumed for. So here we would say students, and then : student ID. And then we would specify the method. So the method, because we could have a post request with this exact same thing, or we could have a get request. We have to specify the method. To specify the method, we do request method. Again, auto imported from here. And then we just do dot, whatever the method is. So this is going to be a get method. Now, so this handles this one right over here. However, we also want to handle the put request. And this is a kind of a perfect example showing you that, hey, we could have two of the exact same routes, but the methods could be different. So what we can do now is just literally copy and paste this and just paste it in again. But instead, this time, we have a put. Cool. All right, so this is awesome. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to quickly over here, just console.log that this middleware was called. Hey, this middleware was called. So let's quickly save that. Let's open up our terminal and let's make a request to one of these two routes, or well, yeah, one of these two routes over here. Let's start off with the slash student slash or colon student ID get. So let's go here, and if we make this request, everything is fine. However, if I actually go back, you can see this middleware was called, but because everything was fine, the next function was called and it went to the controller. Now let's provide it with a student ID that doesn't actually belong inside of our database. So let's just change this from 3 to 4. Let's make this request. We get an error. So now we have a status 400 error saying that students have not been found. And that's great. That's pretty much how middleware is used. So we can actually do the same thing over here and make that request again. Yeah, and that's basically, we can basically modify this middleware for however kind of functionality we want. If we want to authorize users, we can use the middleware. If we want to authenticate users, we can use the middleware. The real point is just knowing how to use a middleware in a Nest application. So that pretty much ends it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next one.